She thought she broke me when she slid divorce papers across the dinner table, smiling while everyone laughed. But she didn't know that I had already set the trap that would tear her empire apart. Subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment because you're about to hear a story you won't forget. The night began like a celebration. The long dining room table glittered under the chandelier, crystal glasses catching the light, polished silverware lined up like soldiers. Friends, relatives, colleagues, they were all there, raising glasses, laughing too loudly, and pretending the food wasn't cold. I sat at the far end, my wife, Linda, beside me, her perfume sharp and sweet. She was radiant that evening, wearing the smile of someone who thought the whole show belonged to her. The clinking of glasses echoed through the room as toasts were made, stories told, laughter shared. I listened, nodded at the right moments, even forced a smile. But beneath that calm surface was a storm. For weeks I had known. The whispers on her phone, the long business dinners, the sudden bursts of new jewelry that had no explanation. I didn't need her to confess. The truth was written in her every careless move. Yet I said nothing. I ate my meal, sipped my wine, and let her believe I was still the quiet, passive husband she could humiliate without consequence. The dining hall smelled of roasted meat and rich sauces, but every bite was ash to me. I kept my head down, my fork steady, my expression unreadable. Across the table, Linda's friends watched me with that smug pity, the kind you reserve for a man too blind to see what was right in front of him. And she fed their amusement, leaning close to whisper jokes, laughing in a way that made sure I noticed. It was theater, every second of it carefully rehearsed. And I played my part, the silent audience. I remember the way the candles flickered, shadows dancing across her face as she reached beneath the table. The moment felt stretched, deliberate. She looked directly at me, her eyes glittering with contempt, and pulled out a manila envelope. With a slow, exaggerated grace, she slid it across the table, the sound of paper unpolished wood cutting through the laughter. "You're free now, Mark," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room went silent for a beat, then erupted into muffled chuckles and poorly hidden grins. A few guests even applauded as if they had just witnessed the climax of a play. Linda leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, basking in the moment like a queen who had finally cast aside her useless servant. "Go on," she pressed, her smile sharp. "Look at them. Sign them. We don't need to pretend anymore." Every eye was on me, some with pity, others with cruel anticipation. I lifted the envelope, studied it without hurry, my face calm, almost bored. Inside, her carefully prepared papers waited, legal words dancing on white sheets, a mockery of our years together. My hand traced the edge of the page, but I said nothing. That silence unsettled her more than any outburst could have. Her smile faltered, just for a second, before she forced it back into place. I closed the envelope and set it down beside my plate. Then I raised my glass of wine, nodded politely to the guests, and drank. No words, no protest, no anger. Just a steady calm that confused them all. Because in that moment, the trap she thought she had set for me had already begun to snap shut. Not on me, but on her. And she didn't even know it yet. The silence that followed lingered like a fog. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations that had been alive a moment before now seemed strangled, reduced to whispers and curious glances. Linda leaned back in her chair, her expression triumphant, certain that she had written the final act of my story. She basked in the attention, soaking up the laughter and the pity that wasn't directed at her but at me. It was the moment she had planned for, and she wanted me broken, humiliated, stripped down in front of every person we knew. But I didn't give her that satisfaction. I simply sat there, my fingers steady on the stem of the wine glass, my face calm, my heartbeat measured. To the guests, that calm was strange, even unsettling. To Linda, it was infuriating. She expected pleading, maybe outrage, maybe a desperate attempt to hold on to her. She expected me to crumble like the man she had convinced herself I was. Instead, I placed the envelope neatly to the side of my plate and resumed my meal as if nothing had happened. The steak had grown cold, the vegetables limp, but I cut them with precision, every bite deliberate. Around me, the laughter died down. Guests shifted uncomfortably, the show they had been promised beginning to feel incomplete. Some of them looked at Linda, searching for her cue to laugh again, but even she faltered. Her smile wavered, her voice tighter when she turned back to me. "Did you hear me, Mark?" she asked, louder this time, almost shrill. "It's over. You're free. Say something." Her eyes sparkled with irritation, desperate to draw blood, but I gave her nothing. Instead, I dabbed my mouth with the napkin and glanced toward her friends, nodding politely as though they were nothing more than polite company. That silence was louder than her announcement, and I could see the unease beginning to spread like cracks in glass. Her brother, a heavy-set man with a taste for cheap whiskey, leaned forward with a grin. "Come on, Mark. Don't take it so hard. She's just putting you out of your misery." Everybody knew it was coming. A few scattered laughs followed, brittle and uncertain. Linda smiled again, regaining some footing, and reached for her glass of champagne. "It's time to celebrate new beginnings," she declared, raising the glass high. "I've wasted enough years pretending. Tonight is the night I finally take control of my life." The guests clapped, some awkwardly, some eagerly, but all of them watched me, waiting for the collapse that never came. Inside, I felt nothing but a cold steadiness. For months, I had lived with the knowledge of her affairs, her secret accounts, her careful siphoning of assets she thought I was too blind to notice. For months, I had played the fool, keeping my silence, building my case piece by piece while she strutted like a queen. I had watched her greed grow, her arrogance swell, and I had learned patience like never before. Tonight was supposed to be her grand performance, the moment she crushed me in front of the people whose approval she craved most. But tonight was also the night her stage would crumble beneath her feet. I let her have her moment, let her bask in the attention. I watched as she laughed too loudly, toasted too aggressively, kissed cheeks and whispered little jabs in ears, her entire being devoted to making sure everyone knew she had one. She mistook my silence for surrender, and that was her mistake. Because behind that silence was a storm she couldn't imagine. When dessert arrived, the tension had shifted. Guests began to sense something wasn't right. My calmness unnerved them. My lack of reaction didn't fit the script they had been invited to watch. Linda grew restless, repeating the story of the papers, making sure each person understood just how clever and powerful she had been. She tapped the envelope with her manicured nail, smirking as she leaned across the table. "You can't ignore this, Mark. Pretending won't make it go away. I've made my choice. You're no longer my problem." Her voice echoed through the dining room, and for a moment, the only sound that followed was the clink of silverware against porcelain. I lifted my eyes to hers, holding her gaze long enough for her smile to falter. Then I spoke, my voice low and steady, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "You're right, Linda," I said. "Pretending won't make anything go away." Her smirk returned, but weaker this time. "Exactly. Finally, you understand." She turned to her friends, eager to relish the moment. But before she could continue, I placed my fork down, folded my napkin, and leaned back in my chair. The room seemed to contract, every eye fixed on me, waiting for what would come next. The air grew heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't curse or shout. I simply let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, until Linda shifted in her chair, her confidence cracking in the weight of my calm. And then I smiled, faint and controlled, the kind of smile that carried no warmth. It was the smile of a man who wasn't broken, wasn't humiliated, wasn't finished. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting for this very moment, and she didn't yet understand why. The guests exchanged uncertain looks, whispers rising again as they realized the scene wasn't playing out the way Linda promised. She leaned closer, her voice tight and urgent. "Say it, Mark. Admit it's over. Admit you've lost." But I didn't. I held her gaze, unflinching, until her hand trembled around the stem of her glass. And in that moment, the dinner shifted. The laughter faded completely. The stage was no longer hers. It belonged to me, though no one yet knew how. The air inside that dining room had turned heavy. So heavy that even the sound of the clock ticking in the hallway seemed louder than the chatter that had filled the house an hour earlier. I could see it in their faces, the discomfort creeping in like a draft under the door. Friends who once smirked at me now shifted in their chairs, uncertain, glancing between me and Linda as though waiting for a verdict. But Linda, she pushed on, desperate to drag me into her performance. She laughed too loudly, leaned back in her chair with exaggerated confidence, and tapped the envelope again with her manicured finger. "He doesn't get it," she told the table, her voice sharp, pitched high to mask the tension. "He thinks this is a game, but everyone here knows it's not. It's the end, Mark, and you're the only one who hasn't realized it." I let her words linger, let them echo off the walls and die in the uneasy silence that followed. Then I reached for my glass again, my movements slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. I raised it to my lips, sipped, and set it back down without breaking her gaze. That simple act unsettled her more than 1,000 shouted protests ever could. I could see her jaw tighten, her chest rising with shallow, impatient breaths. The calmness I wore like armor was her undoing, though she didn't know it yet. Around the table, a cousin of hers cleared his throat and muttered, "Maybe we should change the subject." His wife nodded, her eyes darting nervously toward me, but Linda wouldn't allow it. She had been planning this night for weeks, maybe months, and she wasn't about to let her grand finale be stolen by my silence. "No," she snapped, her eyes flashing. "We don't need to change the subject. We need to face it. He needs to face it. I'm done with this marriage, and I'm not afraid to say it in front of everyone. He's been nothing but dead weight, and tonight I'm cutting him loose." Gasps rippled across the table, followed by a few forced chuckles from those too cowardly to do anything but laugh along. She mistook that nervous laughter for support and smiled again, a cruel, victorious grin. But behind her, I caught sight of something different. Her aunt, a quiet woman who had never liked the theatrics, sat stiffly with her fork frozen in midair, her eyes fixed on me with something like pity. Even her brother, the loud one, looked less certain now, his grin faltering as he took another drink of whiskey. The cracks in Linda's performance were showing, though she couldn't see them. She was too blinded by her hunger to humiliate me. She reached for the envelope again, pulling out the papers and spreading them across the table as if they were trophies. "Here it is," she announced, sliding them toward me with a flourish. "The end of your story. All you need to do is sign." Her voice echoed through the hall, her hands trembling slightly, though she tried to hide it. I looked down at the papers, reading the bold letters that marked the beginning of the end of our marriage. But I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for a pen. Instead, I folded the papers back into the envelope with the same precision I'd used to close a book I'd already finished. Then I pushed it back across the table to her side. Her laughter faltered this time. "What's the matter, Mark? Afraid to face reality?" she mocked, but the words rang hollow, lacking the venom she intended. I tilted my head slightly, studying her, and then said softly, "You should be the one afraid." The room fell into complete silence. Not a fork moved, not a breath stirred. Every guest froze, eyes flicking from me to her, waiting for what would come next. Linda laughed nervously, glancing around the table for support. "He's bluffing," she muttered. "He always bluffs." But I didn't move, didn't smile, didn't look away. That steady gaze of mine, the one she had dismissed so many times as weakness, pinned her to her chair. She shifted uncomfortably, her hand tightening on the glass of champagne until I thought it might shatter in her grip. Minutes passed like hours, the tension building until even the servants standing at the edges of the room seemed restless. Finally, Linda slammed her glass onto the table, the sharp crack making a few guests jump. "Enough," she spat. "You think you're strong because you sit there and say nothing? You think your silence makes you powerful? Let me tell you something, Mark. You're nothing without me. Nothing. Her voice broke on that last word, and the silence that followed was brutal. Even the laughter that had once fueled her performance was gone. I leaned forward slowly, folding my hands on the table, and spoke in a low voice that carried to every corner of the room. Linda, you've mistaken my silence for weakness. That was your first mistake. But your second mistake will cost you more than you realize. Her eyes widened, her lips parting as though she wanted to respond, but nothing came. The guests exchanged glances, whispers rising again, uncertain, afraid to side with her now. She had wanted this dinner to be my downfall, a public stage where she tore me apart. Instead, it had become something else entirely, a stage where her arrogance exposed her. And though she didn't know it, the final act was about to begin. I sat back again, calm as ever, and let the weight of my words hang in the air. Linda tried to recover, forcing a smile, lifting her glass again. But her hand trembled and the wine nearly spilled over the rim. She looked around the table, but the support she had counted on was no longer there. Friends avoided her eyes, relatives shifted in their seats, and the celebration she had planned now felt more like a trial where she was the only one on the stand. And so I waited, letting her drown in the silence she had once used against me. The room belonged to me now, though she still didn't understand it. The game had shifted, the balance had changed, and the night was far from over. The final act came without warning. The air was tight, the guests restless, the weight of silence pressing down on every soul in the room. Linda leaned forward, desperate to reclaim control, her lips parting to deliver yet another performance. But before she could speak, the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall creaked open. The sound was sharp and sudden, and every head turned. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, carrying a leather briefcase, his expression unreadable. He wasn't a waiter, wasn't a guest, and from the moment his polished shoes struck the marble floor, the balance of power shifted entirely. He moved with authority, his eyes sweeping the room until they landed on Linda. "Mrs. Sullivan?" he asked, his voice clear, official. The sound cut through the air like a gavel. Linda blinked, confused, her practiced smile faltering. "Yes?" she answered, trying to mask her unease with charm. The man set his briefcase on the table, opened it with a precise click, and pulled out a set of documents far thicker than the envelope she had mocked me with earlier. "By order of the court," he began, his tone sharp. "Effective immediately, all personal and business accounts under the name Linda Sullivan are hereby frozen. Additionally, your business interests are placed under temporary management pending further investigation." The words rolled out with the weight of final judgment. Chairs scraped against the floor as guests shifted, gasping, whispering, eyes wide with shock. Linda's face drained of color, her confident mask crumbling into sheer disbelief. "That's impossible," she stammered, standing so quickly her chair toppled over. "There must be a mistake. You can't just come in here and—" But the man cut her off with the steady calm of someone who had dealt with such protests countless times. "This is not a mistake, ma'am. These orders are signed by Judge Harrison. You may contest them in court, but until then the ruling stands." He placed the stamped papers directly in front of her, the official seal gleaming under the chandelier light. The room erupted in murmurs, guests leaning in to whisper, eyes darting between her and me. For once, all the laughter was gone. Even her closest friends, the ones who had smirked at me earlier, now turned their faces away, unwilling to be associated with the disaster unfolding at the table. Linda grabbed the papers, flipping through them with trembling hands, her voice rising in panic. "This is ridiculous. Who do you think you are? Who set this up?" I lifted my wine glass, my expression calm, my movements steady. The ruby liquid caught the light as I swirled it gently. Then, for the first time that evening, I spoke clearly enough for all to hear. "Thank you," I said, raising the glass in a slow toast. "For new beginnings." My voice carried through the stunned silence, sharp as a blade, final as a verdict. Linda froze, the words sinking into her like stones into deep water. Her eyes locked on mine, wide with the dawning realization that this wasn't chance, wasn't some bureaucratic mistake. This was deliberate. This was planned. And it had been unfolding right under her nose while she paraded her arrogance in front of the world. The whispers in the room grew louder now, but they weren't about me. They were about her. Her downfall. Her ruin. She tried to speak again. Her words choked. Broken. "Mark, you did this?" Her voice cracked, desperation dripping from every syllable. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence was enough, and it spoke louder than any confession. She collapsed back into her chair, the papers clutched in her hands like a lifeline that had already snapped. Around her, friends avoided her gaze. Relatives shifted uncomfortably, and the triumph she had savored only an hour ago was gone, replaced with humiliation so raw it burned in the air. The court representative closed his briefcase, bowed his head slightly, and left without another word. The doors shut behind him with a thud that echoed like the closing of a cell. No one dared to speak. No one dared to laugh. The only sound was the faint clink of my glass as I set it back down on the polished table. I watched Linda, her shoulders hunched, her eyes wet, her hands trembling. The queen of the evening had been stripped bare before her court, and now she sat alone in her ruin. I rose slowly, adjusting my jacket, and looked around the room. Some guests met my eyes with respect, others with awe, but none with pity. I had taken back everything she had stolen, not through shouting, not through pleading, but through patience, preparation, and silence. I walked toward the door, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the hall, leaving Linda to drown in the wreckage she had created for herself. And as I stepped out into the cool night, I understood something with perfect clarity. Sometimes the most devastating answer is not fury, not chaos, but quiet certainty. She handed me papers meant to end me. The judge handed her ruin she could never recover from. And in that moment, she finally learned what I had known all along. Silence, when wielded with precision, is louder than any scream. If you've stayed with me through the story, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Because sometimes, the endings we least expect are the ones that leave us speechless.